They weren't numbers, they weren't shadows, they were mothers, fathers, children. And for years the world forgot what their daily life truly looked like behind the barbed wire. When we talk about the Holocaust, we think of death camps and liberation. But almost nothing is ever said about the in-between. The years of slow starvation, forced labor, secret friendships, whispered prayers, and the quiet defiance that kept people human in a place designed to erase their humanity. This is not the story of battles or generals. This is the story of survival, hour by hour, breath by breath. What was a normal day inside the ghettos? How did Jewish families hold on to hope when the world around them burned? And what hidden acts of resistance did they dare to commit, even under the eyes of the SS? Tonight we uncover the forbidden truth, the real, unfiltered life of the Jews during the Holocaust. When the world of European Jewry collapsed, it didn't happen in a single night. It happened through 1,000 small humiliations that gradually became the new reality. The hidden world of Jewish life during the Holocaust was not one of open rebellion or visible defiance, but one of quiet endurance in the face of absolute control. It began with ghettos, walled prisons in the middle of Europe's cities: Warsaw, Lodz, Krakow, Vilna. Names that once stood for centuries of Jewish culture became the last addresses of entire communities. Behind those walls, life continued, but only just. The streets were overcrowded, the air thick with smoke and disease. Every day, carts rolled past filled with bodies wrapped in rags, victims not of bullets but of hunger, typhus, and despair. And yet, life refused to die. Teachers gathered children in secret basements to teach them letters and prayers. Musicians played broken violins in the ruins to remind people that beauty still existed somewhere. Rabbis held sermons in whispers, their voices trembling but defiant. Every loaf of bread, every smuggled potato, every shared sip of soup became an act of rebellion. Children became messengers and smugglers, slipping through cracks in the ghetto walls to trade trinkets for food. They learned to move like ghosts, silent, invisible, and always hungry. Their small hands carried the hope of entire families, while SS patrols and local police hunted them like rats. Many were caught, some disappeared forever. But the ghetto children became symbols of something the Nazis couldn't fully destroy: the will to live. In the Lodz ghetto, a man named Mordechai Chaim Rumkowski ruled like a self-declared king under German command. His words, "Give me your children," still echo through history. He believed that by cooperating, by turning labor into value for the Reich, some lives could be spared. He was wrong, but his desperate calculations showed the impossible choices the Jews were forced to make: survive one more day or resist and die instantly. As deportations began, trains arrived daily. People were told they were being resettled to the east. They lined up obediently, clutching small bundles: bread, blankets, a family photo. They didn't know that beyond those railway tracks waited only the chimneys. Rumors leaked back of camps where smoke rose day and night. But many refused to believe. How could they? No human mind could yet imagine the scale of industrial death. Inside the ghettos, a new underground world formed. The Judenrat councils, black markets, hidden presses printing illegal newspapers, and underground theatres that performed forbidden plays in candlelight. To laugh even once was a kind of freedom. To sing was an act of defiance. There were lovers too, forbidden romances between people who knew tomorrow could mean deportation. They married in secret, exchanged rings made of wire, and swore that even if they were separated, their souls would find each other in the smoke above Auschwitz. Letters were written on scraps of fabric, hidden in walls under floorboards. Tiny fragments of love in a world collapsing into ash. But the descent was relentless. By 1942, the ghettos began to empty. The Nazis called it Aktion Reinhard, the final liquidation of Jewish life in occupied Poland. Streets that once overflowed with noise fell silent. The sound of boots, gunfire, and screams replaced the laughter of children. Families were torn apart on the selection ramps. The old, the sick, and the young were dragged to waiting trucks, told they were going to work. Few returned. Those who remained faced an impossible choice: to wait and die or to fight. In Warsaw, whispers spread of resistance. Young men and women formed secret units, hiding pistols in loaves of bread, smuggling grenades through sewers. When the final liquidation began in April 1943, the ghettos exploded in flames. For nearly a month, Jewish fighters held off the SS with almost nothing. The sky turned black with smoke, but for those days they were not victims, they were free. Still, most Jews didn't have the luxury of fighting. Their resistance was silent, spiritual. Mothers risked their lives to light Sabbath candles. Children memorized Hebrew prayers, though they had no books left. Men tore pieces from prayer shawls to wrap their dead. In the camps, prisoners found ways to carve words into wood or scratch names onto walls, proof that they existed, that they had once been human. Some priests and farmers outside the ghettos risked everything to hide Jewish families in attics, cellars and barns. The price for being discovered was death, not just for the Jews, but for the families who helped them. Yet still, some chose compassion. Every secret door, every hidden tunnel, every forged document was a rebellion against the Nazi vision of a world without Jews. And beneath it all was fear, constant suffocating fear. Fear of the next knock at the door, fear of the next train. Fear that tomorrow you might wake up alone, or not at all. But within that fear lived something even stronger, the refusal to let go of humanity. The hidden world of Jewish life during the Holocaust was not only about suffering, it was about the small miracles that happened in the cracks of hell, the smuggled loaf, the secret prayer, the stolen kiss before dawn. They lived in darkness, but somehow they found ways to shine. When the trains finally reached their destinations, the Jews entered a world beyond reason, a place where death was not the end but a daily routine. The iron gates of Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor and Majdanek opened not to fields or factories, but to the machinery of annihilation. The air was heavy with smoke, the ground slick with ash. Prisoners stumbled from cattle cars half dead already, clutching bundles that would soon be stripped from them. Orders were barked in German, left, right. And with that motion of a hand, lives were divided between a few weeks of suffering and immediate death. Those chosen for work entered a life stripped of all meaning. Numbers were tattooed on their arms, names erased, hair shaved away. The first shock was the smell, burning flesh, chemical smoke, the stench of despair that clung to every breath. Hunger gnawed constantly. Disease spread faster than hope. Every rule, every word, every gesture carried risk. Even to whisper a prayer could earn a beating. Yet still, in the quiet corners of the barracks, people whispered anyway. They prayed to a God who seemed silent, if only to remind themselves they were still human. Every morning began before dawn. Under the screams of guards and the crack of whips, prisoners lined up for roll call, standing motionless for hours in freezing wind or driving rain. Those who collapsed were beaten until they rose, or until they stopped moving altogether. Work was endless, often pointless. Hauling stones, digging ditches, carrying bricks back and forth until night. The SS called it re-education through labour. But everyone knew the truth. This was death by exhaustion, death by design. The human body was turned into fuel to be burned slowly, efficiently, until nothing was left. Inside the barracks, the nights were worse. Coughs, sobs, whispers of names that would never be answered again. People traded bread for medicine, or just for a word of kindness. Lice crawled in the straw, frost crept through the walls. Yet even here, friendship bloomed in the dark. Prisoners shared everything, a crust of bread, a stolen potato, a memory of home. Some recited poetry, others sang softly in Yiddish or Polish, songs of mothers and rivers and springtime that no longer existed. In those moments, even death paused to listen. Women suffered doubly. Many were forced into labor units or medical experiments. Others endured violations too cruel to speak aloud. Pregnant women were sent straight to the gas chambers, unfit for work, the SS called them. But some hid their pregnancies, giving birth in the shadows of barracks, wrapping newborns in scraps of stolen cloth. Most of those babies never lived long, yet for a brief moment they represented something greater, life-defying death itself. A single heartbeat in Auschwitz was an act of resistance. The guards, often young men barely out of their teens, became instruments of terror. They laughed as they beat prisoners, took trophies, and staged mock games of mercy. Yet behind their eyes was something hollow, a reflection of what happens when cruelty becomes duty. Prisoners learned to read that emptiness. They knew who might kick them for sport and who might look the other way when they stole a sip of soup. Humanity flickered unpredictably, like a candle in a storm, but even the faintest flicker was remembered forever. By 1943, the breaking point had come. People no longer believed they would survive, yet they kept moving step by step, as if driven by something beyond will. Suicide was common. Some threw themselves at the electric fences, others walked into the gunfire. But for many, the thought of revenge, or the faint hope of telling the world what happened, kept them alive. They dreamed of seeing the sky without barbed wire again, of hearing their real names spoken aloud. Survival became not just endurance, but rebellion. And in rare, desperate moments, rebellion became literal. In Treblinka and Sobibor, prisoners rose up, seizing weapons, setting fire to the death camps themselves. They knew they would die, but they wanted to die fighting, not waiting. Smoke rose above the forests of Poland, black against the grey sky. A few escaped and lived to tell the story, but most were hunted down. Still, their defiance proved one thing. Even in the heart of the Holocaust, resistance was possible. The Nazis could murder bodies, but they could not fully conquer the human spirit. The breaking point was not only physical, it was spiritual. Many prisoners lost faith, convinced that God had turned his face away. Others found their faith strengthened, clinging to prayer as the last thread of sanity. The question of why haunted every man and woman who survived. Why them? Why this? And yet, amid all the horror, some still believed there must be a purpose, that perhaps their suffering would one day bear witness to humanity's deepest failure and its faintest redemption. As the war dragged on, rumors spread that the Germans were losing. Prisoners saw signs, guards nervous, officers fleeing, rations thinning. But hope was dangerous. The camps grew even crueler in their final months, as the SS tried to erase the evidence. Mass graves were dug up and burned, records destroyed. Those too weak to work were executed on the spot. Liberation was near, but for many it was already too late. The breaking point had come, and it had taken nearly everything, yet somehow a few survived. Barely human, skin and bone, eyes sunken but alive. When the gates finally opened and soldiers from the east and west entered the camps, what they saw defied comprehension. The survivors could not speak, the liberators could not breathe. The world would later call it horror, tragedy, genocide. But for those who lived it, it was something beyond words. Because at the breaking point, they discovered something the Nazis never understood, that even when stripped of everything, a human soul can still choose to remember, to feel, to tell the truth. By the winter of 1944, the Nazi Empire was crumbling. The Reich that once boasted of 1,000-year rule was rotting from within, eaten alive by its own lies. Allied bombers scorched German cities, the Eastern Front collapsed under the Soviet tide. Yet behind the chaos, the death factories still operated with mechanical precision. The SS forced prisoners to destroy crematoria, burn records, and bury every trace of their crimes. They believed that if the evidence vanished, so would the guilt, but truth, like smoke, always finds a way to rise. In the camps, prisoners began to sense a shift in the air, whispers that the Germans were retreating, that liberation was near. Hope was a dangerous luxury, yet it flickered in hollow eyes. The guards grew crueler, frantic and afraid. Orders came to evacuate camps and march the survivors westward, away from the advancing Red Army. Tens of thousands were forced onto death marches, stumbling through snow and mud with no food, no rest, and no destination. For many, the collapse of the Reich felt no different from its reign, only colder, hungrier, slower. The roads of Europe became rivers of corpses. Those who fell were shot, those who survived carried on in silence, too numb to cry. Villagers watched as columns of skeletal figures passed through their towns, some realizing for the first time what the Nazi machine had truly done. The SS tried to keep up appearances, pretending these were transfers, but even the most loyal soldiers began to understand the truth. The empire built on terror was imploding, and its crimes were too vast to bury. Inside Germany, panic turned to denial. Propaganda ministers urged citizens to fight for the Führer, even as their homes burned and their sons disappeared on the front lines. But rumors of the camps began to spread. Railway workers, farmers and soldiers whispered about the places in the east where no one ever returned. Some civilians claimed ignorance. Others looked away. The moral collapse of a nation was complete. Millions chose silence over conscience, pretending not to see the smoke rising from the forests. Then, in January 1945, The Red Army reached the gates of Auschwitz. What they found was beyond comprehension. Piles of bones, warehouses full of shoes, hair, and children's toys. The soldiers, hardened by years of war, wept. Survivors stumbled toward them, half dead, unable to believe they were free. Cameras captured the faces of the living and the dead, revealing to the world what the Nazis had tried to erase. The myth of the German New Order died in those images, replaced by the undeniable evidence of genocide. As liberation spread across Europe, the full scale of the Holocaust emerged. British troops at Bergen-Belsen found 60,000 starving inmates and 10,000 corpses rotting in the open. Americans at Buchenwald and Dachau discovered rooms filled with human skin, medical experiments, and mountains of ashes. The liberators were ordered to document everything, film, photograph, record. They wanted the world to see, so that no one could ever deny it. Yet even with proof in front of them, many struggled to believe humans could do this to each other. For the survivors, freedom came too late for the families they lost. Liberation did not mean healing. It meant remembering. Many were too weak to walk, too broken to feel joy. Some died within days of being rescued, their bodies finally giving out after years of starvation. Others searched the ruins of Europe for loved ones who would never return, and in displaced persons camps, they began to rebuild the fragments of identity that the Nazis had tried to erase: names, languages, faith, and hope. The SS men who once strutted with arrogance now fled in disguise. Some burned their uniforms, others hid among refugees or fled overseas, but the Allies hunted them relentlessly. In 1945, at Nuremberg, the world placed the architects of the Holocaust on trial. For the first time in history, words like crimes against humanity entered the legal lexicon. Film reels of the camps were shown to the court, silent witnesses that spoke louder than any testimony. And in that courtroom, truth finally stood taller than fear. But exposure came with questions no tribunal could answer. How could a modern, educated nation organize the systematic murder of 6 million people? How could neighbors turn against neighbors? Priests remain silent, doctors become executioners. The collapse of the Nazi regime revealed more than its crimes. It revealed how fragile civilization truly is. Evil did not arrive in monsters, but in uniforms, offices, and polite obedience. The Holocaust was not a storm from outside humanity. It was born within it. Even after Germany surrendered, the shadows of the camps lingered. Survivors carried nightmares that never faded: the smell of smoke, the sound of boots, the faces of those left behind. Some emigrated to Palestine or America, searching for a place untouched by war. Others stayed in Europe, determined to bear witness. Never again, they said, a promise carved from grief. But as the world rebuilt, the images of liberation began to fade into history, their horror diluted by distance and time. And yet the truth refused to stay buried. Decades later, historians uncovered hidden documents, secret testimonies, forgotten photographs. Each fragment pieced together a clearer picture of the machine that had consumed millions. The exposure of the Holocaust was not just the collapse of a regime, it was the unveiling of humanity's darkest mirror. What had been done in secrecy now stood exposed before the world, demanding one eternal question. How did it happen? The Reich had fallen, the camps were silent, but the echoes of their crimes still screamed through the rubble of Europe. The world finally saw, and once seen, it could never look away again. The war had ended, but the silence that followed was heavier than the sound of any bomb. Across Europe, the survivors of the Holocaust wandered through ruins that no longer felt like home. Entire families were gone, entire neighborhoods erased. The world around them pretended to move forward, rebuilding cities, celebrating peace. But for those who had seen the camps, time had split in two. Before the war, and after, nothing would ever bridge that distance again. They were free, yet haunted by freedom itself. In the years that followed, the survivors carried their memories like invisible scars. Many refused to speak, fearing no one would understand, and they were right. The world wanted heroes and victories, not the uncomfortable truth of what had been done in the shadows. When survivors told their stories, some were met with disbelief, others with silence, so they buried their pain deep inside, rebuilding lives out of fragments. They married, worked, raised children, but in every quiet moment the ghosts returned. There were nights when they woke screaming, still hearing the dogs, the shouting, the gunfire. The smell of smoke lingered in their dreams. Some survivors clung to faith, believing they had been spared for a reason. Others abandoned it completely, unable to reconcile a merciful God with what they had seen, yet all shared one unspoken vow, that the truth must not die with them. They had survived not just to live, but to remember. And remembering became their form of resistance. Meanwhile, the world began to write its own version of history. Governments spoke of liberation, of justice served, but few spoke of complicity. Many former Nazis melted back into society, protected by silence or by the Cold War's shifting priorities. Even in places far from Germany, people preferred to forget. The images of the camps were too disturbing, too easy to look away from. Memory itself became a battlefield, between those who wanted to remember and those who wanted to erase. In the 1950s and 60s, the children of survivors began asking questions their parents could not answer. They found old photographs hidden in drawers, yellowed documents with numbers and stamps. Slowly, the buried truth resurfaced, memoirs were written, testimonies recorded. The world began to confront what had been hidden beneath layers of denial. Museums rose where ashes once fell. Every display, every photograph, every name carved into stone whispered the same thing: this happened. And it could happen again. But remembrance came at a cost. For survivors, reopening the past was like reopening a wound that had never healed. They stood in front of schoolchildren and spoke of starvation, fear, and death, and afterward went home to cry in silence. Some could never tell their own children everything. Others spoke so often that their lives became a single endless testimony. They knew the danger of forgetting. History, after all, does not repeat itself by accident. It repeats itself when people choose not to remember. Even today, decades later, the ghosts of the Holocaust still linger in the soil of Europe. Beneath quiet forests and fields lie the ashes of millions. Some graves are marked, others are not. Birds sing above them, unaware of the silence beneath their wings. Tourists visit Auschwitz, walk its gravel paths, and take photographs. But few can truly grasp what those grounds once held. The air itself seems to remember, heavy and cold, as if it refuses to forgive the living, and yet among the ruins of memory there are glimmers of something else: defiance, love, and continuity. The children and grandchildren of survivors carry forward names that were meant to be erased. They light candles every year, not only to mourn but to declare existence. Jewish culture, once targeted for extinction, flourishes again in the same cities where it was nearly destroyed. Each song, each prayer, each life born into freedom stands as a quiet victory over the machinery of death. But the truth buried beneath history is not only Jewish, it is human. The Holocaust revealed how easily ordinary people can become instruments of evil when obedience replaces morality. It showed how silence feeds atrocity more than hatred itself. Every generation that forgets risks becoming the next to repeat it. The lessons of the camps are not confined to the past. They echo in every act of dehumanization, every time a person is stripped of their name and turned into a number. When we speak of the Holocaust, we often focus on the darkness, but perhaps the deeper truth lies in the light that somehow survived it, in the mothers who sang lullabies to their children in hiding, in the men who shared their last crumbs of bread, in the strangers who risked everything to save another's life. Those moments, fleeting, fragile, human, are proof that even in a world built on death, life found a way to endure. That, too, is part of the truth the Nazis could never bury. And so the responsibility falls to us, the living, to guard that truth, not just in memorials or history books, but in the way we see the world. The Holocaust is not distant history. It is a warning carved into the soul of humanity. To forget it is to let it happen again, in another form, under another flag, to another people. Memory is our last defense, the thin wall between civilization and the abyss. Because buried beneath the ruins of Auschwitz, beneath the ashes of Europe, lies not just the story of the Jews, but the story of us all. The proof of how low humanity can sink, and how somehow it can still rise again.